welcome to WIC. My name is Lauren Cope, and I'm the manager of Living Collections here. Central to our living collection are the roses, which currently are in full bloom. So thank you for your patience this week as we postponed the tour a little bit because the roses were a little bit slow to bloom due to the cool weather. But we really appreciate you tuning in today, and we hope you enjoy this rose tour. Thanks so much.
So first, to begin this tour, I would like to orient you to the overall site and its residents to better contextualize this garden for you and provide overarching insights into its development. WIC as it exists today and the surrounding 2.5 acres of land that remain of the original parcel have been standing in place on this Germantown block for over 300 years, and it has been the family seat of the Wistar-Haynes family for 9 generations. This is rather remarkable considering the home is located just outside one of the oldest major cities in the United States, which during this time has experienced so much development, industrialization, and expansion like any city surrounding its location. I find it compelling to think that anyone walking along Germantown Avenue in the last 200 years would immediately recognize WIC looking much the same. Today, it is exceptional that we still have WIC's original home, land, and authentic accessory buildings to use in site interpretation. I find, though, the real treasure of WIC, for me, is that even today it continues to maintain its integrity of spirit. In its span of 3 centuries of singular family ownership by the Wistar-Haynes family, WIC's land remained a valued and cherished asset, even as it changed from a farmstead to a stately country seat to its eventual transition to a nonprofit in the 1970s. Agrarianism and horticulture were intrinsic parts of the daily life and interests of this family throughout their tenure and even beyond. This is in keeping with many of the shared tenets of Quakerism, of which this family identified. They felt inspired and humbled by the natural world, and their agrarian and horticultural pursuits were often accomplished with a scientific eye. Many family members also delved into the natural sciences, exploring such fields as geology and botany through surveys of natural areas both at home and beyond, such as the Wissahickon. For many members of the family over generations of WIC's history, their values and interests extended into their community interactions, and many had leading roles in the development and organization of various cultural institutions that still exist today in Philadelphia. Examples of these are the Academy of Natural Sciences, American Philosophical Society, the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, and the first horticultural school for women, which today is now Temple Ambler Campus. Even as WIC became a nonprofit in the 1970s, the organization continued to place value on WIC's legacy of horticulture and agriculture. Today, we still actively engage in both these disciplines and share them with our community through programs such as the Home Farm Club and events like Celebrate the Roses. When speaking to the integrity of spirit at WIC, I still feel there is an essence in this place that encourages us to see the value of wonder and curiosity when interacting with the natural world. I hope this helps place the garden in better context for you. Now let's have a look inside. Here we are standing in the rose garden, which dates back almost squarely 200 years. 1821 was when Jane Bown Haynes first started conceptualizing this garden, and over the course of a few years after, the installation was completed. We often cite WIC as being the oldest rose garden in the United States still in its original plan. And while I do feel that the age of this garden is certainly impressive, as detailed earlier in this tour, it's important to note that this garden was never designed to live in a stasis to achieve only the superlative. Rather, this garden's significance and uniqueness lies more in the types of roses that were planted here originally and still persist today, and its resistance to change in spite of a renaissance that occurred in rose breeding in the late 1800s and early 1900s. When Jane Bown Haynes originally began drawing for this rose garden and composing the plant palette, she used a common design plan at the time based on symmetrical beds called parterres. These were surrounded by herbaceous plants and delineated by low-growing hedges or gravel. Here at Wick, they are boxwoods. Parterres were a common composition at the time in American colonial gardens and show the direct influence of European garden style. Originating in France, these parterres, coupled with hedging, were used to formalize the space, often resulting in long, grand perspectives that readily showed the human hand in the landscape. They were especially effective when viewed from an elevated perspective, such as the second floor of the home. Though we see this drafted at Wick on a much humbler scale, it is with this plan that we see this space make a transition from being a functional, utilitarian space for herbs and vegetables to a more stylized and aesthetic endeavor with an inclination towards engagement, entertaining, and display. When Jane Bound began to source roses and plant materials for her garden, she had many high-quality options at the time. Originally being from Flushing, New York, she was close in proximity and even had family ties to two very well-known nurseries, specifically Prince's Nursery and Parsons Nursery. Both of these establishments were actively importing plants primarily from Europe and were responsible for many new introductions of plant species and roses to early colonial gardens. In addition, there were many popular nurseries in Philadelphia and even in Germantown that offered interesting plants and even specialized in roses. We are fortunate to have original catalogs from the Prince's Nursery where we know Jane sourced some of the original plants for this rose garden. There is also much correspondence between the Bound-Haynes family at Wick and the Parsons Nursery, which was owned by her extended family. Reading through these catalogs in the present day, it is often hard to distinguish rose varieties and cultivars, and this has caused much confusion in the rose world. Part of this, I think, comes from the fact that roses hybridize quite readily and there are limitless combinations. Another reason is that during the time much of this early breeding was taking place, we did not have photographs or easy lines of global communication to make positive identification of all of these rose hybrids and their origins. People at the time were relying on written descriptions, drawings, and even paintings for identification of very nuanced colors and plant features. Advertising in catalogs and publications frequently embellished colors as well. What's more, it was very common for roses to be named for notable people, places, and events that took place locally, and therefore it's not uncommon to find a rose with several different aliases, depending on location. One such rose in our collection, Lafayette, is believed to have been planted in honor of Marquis de Lafayette's return visit to the United States in 1824. To read more on that, I'd invite you to follow us on Facebook or social media, where we posted a more detailed story on this. One trait in common between all of the roses first planted in this garden is that they bloomed only once. Up until the late 1800s, this was the case for most all roses in the trade. However, in the late 19th and early 20th century, roses began to be crossed with the China rose, which had the ability to rebloom, and gave birth to a class of rose we call the hybrid tea. These are the roses that you or I find most commonly today in supermarkets or give them for Valentine's Day. This revelation in rose breeding captivated gardeners as it allowed them to enjoy their beloved roses throughout the season. By the turn of the 20th century, these reblooming qualities had taken precedence in breeding programs, and gardens which included these what we now call old garden roses were largely cast off. Once blooming roses were by and large removed from American gardens and replanted with glamorous, reblooming varieties. Most rose gardens that we have in the United States today were established during this time in the early 1900s and are composed predominantly of these reblooming types. At the time when this renaissance was happening within the rose world, Wick was in the care of Jane Reuben Haynes. daughter of Jane Bownhains, who originally designed the rose garden. Most tragically, Jane had lost her father before birth, and soon after, her grief-stricken mother passed away as well, leaving her an orphan at only 10 years old. The influence of these events instilled in her a sentimental desire to preserve the home and garden as it was in the time of her parents' residence. Therefore, we have Jane Rubenhains to thank for the preservation of Wick's Rose Garden as we move into the early 20th century. Subsequent generations would further expand this existing rose collection, such as adding climbing roses to the front facade. Today, Wick remains as a testament to the value of a living collection, and it allows us to glimpse into the vernacular history of a family's home place. Many of the roses growing in this garden today are clonal stands which have regenerated themselves over the years, such as Elegant Gallica, Lita, and Lafayette. Still others are growing from the original rootstock, which is now incredibly old and weathered. Though these once blooming old garden roses have at times in history been scoffed at for their short window of bloom, I find there is such a magic about an old garden rose. Words such as romantic, charming, or beguiling often come to mind when we describe these old garden roses. They mesmerize us with their consuming perfume and soft, ruffled petals. What's more, their short bloom time teases us in eager anticipation of their bloom. And so, for most of the year, this small, unassuming garden hides in plain sight until the moment when it will suddenly burst into an exuberant display that will fill the air with a rich, heavenly scent of roses, as it has now for the last 200 years. Thank you so much for joining us today on this virtual tour of Wick's historic rose garden. We do hope you will visit us in the future and immerse yourself in the scent and experience of this garden in rose season and beyond. For even more information on this garden's history and design, we invite you to check out Wick's podcast, The Curiosity Cabinet, where Wick staff discusses the garden's history more in depth with the renowned gardener, educator, historian, and author, Jenny Rose Carey. Thank you again for watching. We wish you good health until we see one another again.